Good evening, friends. Good to see such a big crowd here tonight. Welcome to this book launch. I'm delighted to introduce my old friend and comrade, Phil Marfleet. Phil is an emeritus professor at the University of East London, which was my old institution, although we taught there at different times. Phil is academic and author, and he's the author of this latest book, which you've come to hear about, Palestine, Imperialism and the Struggle for Freedom. Phil, of course, is a Middle East expert. He's written extensively on the Middle East and on refugees as well. Phil, it's interesting that you provide an image of Palestinians in your book, which is was the first thing that struck me actually reading it. It's completely opposite to the usual familiar image in the Western media of Palestinians as victims, or as meek, submissive victims, instead of which you provide an image of Palestinians as fighters, resistors, fighters against injustice, no longer simply as victims, no longer simply as passive absorbers of injustice. Can you respond to that?
It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about Palestine, even though of course it's under very, very difficult circumstances. So in response to Sabby's question, the first thing I want to say is that the Palestinian writer Noor Masalha, whose work you might have come across, a historian, he talks about the Palestinians having been subjected to what he calls memoricide, a sustained attempt to negate Palestinian history and indeed Palestinian existence, not just in the physical sense, but in the sense of negating Palestinians' lived experience over many generations, and certainly their resistance to two forces which have shaped the history of Palestine since the period of the First World War, and of course that was the British colonial presence and later on the Zionist movement. The idea that peoples like the Palestinians are overwhelmingly, in some sense, passive. I mean, this has been a feature, I think, of the way that colonial powers, European colonial powers, have treated subordinated peoples for many centuries. On the other hand, when people have resisted, I mean, the British Empire provides all sorts of examples for us, they're then often characterised as less meek and passive than as perverse, maybe even crazy, for not accepting the agendas of the colonial powers that have controlled them. And this is certainly true in the Palestinian case. The idea of a type of meekness or passivity is also, I think, overlain in the Arab region under the colonial powers by Islamophobia. Really, especially since the 19th century, there was an approach, particularly from British strategists and politicians and British academics, who argued that Islam, obviously the religion of the majority of the people in the region, induced passivity in people, and that they weren't capable of thinking rationally and pursuing rational strategies. So, I mean, all these come together in the Palestinian experience, first of all, under the British, and then later on, and I think we'll talk a bit more about this later, under the impact of the Zionist presence. One of the key features of the Zionist settler movement, and later on the State of Israel, declared in 1948 as a sovereign state, has been the attempt not just to present Palestinians as passive or meek, but in a very sustained way to remove much of the evidence of Palestinian lives in all sorts of ways. I mean, I think people probably in the room will be familiar with the way in which after 1948, after the Nakba of 1948, hundreds of Palestinian villages and urban neighbourhoods were systematically destroyed by agencies of the Israeli state, so that the physical evidence of Palestinian lives was no longer there. If we read a book like the key text of Theodor Herzl, The Jewish State, written I think in the 1890s, a book like that is profoundly influenced by and reflects the ideas of the European state itself, but more importantly, European imperial ideas. Because after all, by the end of the 19th century, major European colonial powers, obviously the British, the French, by that point the Belgians, even the Germans, had not only had been for a very long time seizing various parts of the world, they'd also been involved, in the case of Britain for example, in inventing chattel slavery in the Caribbean and the states of North America, of perpetrating genocides. Australia, I mean, the British colonial state, with the backing of the British government and ideologists of empire, perpetrated a genocide in Australia which all but removed the indigenous people. One could go on. France in North Africa, Germany in the early years of the 20th century in what's today's Namibia. So, and these ideas of clearances and evacuations and occupation were really not contentious. And so the leaders of the Zionist movement, who had all sorts of reasons of their own, of course, Jewish communities for seeking safety and security, absorbed many of these ideas and translated them into the praxis of a movement which was that of a colonial settler project. And colonial settler projects bring into being institutions and people, particularly leaders of institutions, who behave in the way that you describe, Sabby, although I don't use the term bullying and the like. They behave in those ways because this was second nature to imperial powers. And of course the Zionist movement aligned itself very, very closely with the British imperial power. I mean, I've looked at this, hopefully with some care in the book. I've looked at the evidence behind the notion, in particular, that in 1947, 1948, Palestinians walked away. I mean, a very important part of the national, let me put it this way, a very important part of the stories that Israelis told themselves, the Israeli institutions, and particularly the Israeli education system, told itself, was that in 1948 Palestinians left because they'd been directed to leave by various traditional leaders within Palestine and heads of Arab states. There is zero evidence that by any means, through print media, through the broadcast media of the time, through institutional networks, that anyone was told to leave. On the contrary, people were urged to remain. And one of the reasons why the Nakba of 1948, the mass displacement, was so particularly brutal was because Palestinians were not getting up by and large and walking away. They resisted. And again, one of the things I brought into the book is the evidence of resistance, the testimony of people in Palestinian villages and urban neighbourhoods who talked about how they fought back. But of course, following the Intifada of 1936, may I continue?
Yeah, please.
I'm going off on a slightly different track here. I find the use of the word Intifada very interesting, by the way. Maybe until 20 years ago, that word would not have had a meaning in European languages. It would have been unfamiliar to us. Now we use the term Intifada in English and other European languages quite comfortably, and it means something to us, doesn't it? And in general, it's seen as a positive mark of resistance, uprising resistance, desire to bring change and so on. In 1936, under the impact of British occupation and the increasingly effective presence, effective in terms of the Zionist project, of the Zionist institutions and militia, such large numbers of Palestinians have been dispossessed of their land and restricted, particularly in urban neighbourhoods, that a great Intifada was launched. And that went on from 1936 to 1939. I think that movement is probably one of the great mass movements of the 20th century, in that there was virtually not a family in Palestine that wasn't involved. We can see this now from the historical work which has been done, although you'll never see this in the mainstream of academic history, and certainly not in media coverage. At this point, British colonial institutions and institutions of the Yishuv, the Zionist community, had increasingly come together. But by the 30s, Zionist military organizations were also highly organized and actually largely supplied with arms and in some cases trained by the British colonial authorities. Again, this is not something you will find in most of the mainstream histories. And when the British military authorities looked at the Palestinian resistance, you know, these people who were causing such trouble, they weren't passive anymore, they weren't meek anymore. Now they were dangerous, perverse people and all terrorists. Of course, they were terrorists. Then the British combined with the Zionist militias without difficulty. That the British arrested, detained and sometimes incarcerated nearly 550,000 people during the course of the Palestinian Intifada. And that's in a country with a population of about 1.3 million.
Why do the Americans continue to fund Israel, to provide such a high level of economic aid, military aid and so on? Is it just oil, or is Israel still a major strategic asset for United States imperialism?
I want to say two things about that, Sabby. The first one is that it's very often thought, because of the long relationship between the United States and Israel, it's very often thought that Israel's allies from the beginning were in North America and Europe, and that isn't quite right. So for example, the first sophisticated weapons that Israel received didn't come from the US. They came via the Soviet Union from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
So it was the, if you like, the Eastern Bloc of the time that associated itself with Israel, which caused all sorts of problems, not least for the left across the Middle East and indeed across the world. It wasn't really until the mid-1960s that the United States navigated its way to a politics of the Middle East which aligned it with the Israeli state. First of all, it became clear, well, probably by the mid-late 50s, that absolutely vast quantities of oil were, oil in the Middle East was first discovered, as people probably know, in Iran, then later it's Iraq, eventually Saudi Arabia, Kuwait and so on. And by the 50s, all the major oil fields have come on stream. And at that point, the energy resources of Europe and North America are overwhelmingly dependent upon not just oil, but upon cheap oil. So the question posed for the United States strategists is that we've got these vital resources there. We've also got very dangerous radical movements which want to nationalize the oil industry, take it away from the great is that the right word? The big American oil corporations, your Exxon, your Texaco, your Standard Oil, and the like. And it became apparent, particularly in the 1967 war, that Israel won very dramatically, very speedily, that there was a force in the region allied very, very closely to Western governments, which could apparently do the job of suppressing these movements, because the Arab armies were defeated, and most importantly Egypt was defeated very, very quickly by the Israeli forces. So here is a very important relationship, strategic relationship between Israel and the West, and particularly the United States.
We often hear the word apartheid as applied to Israel, which of course comes from the South African apartheid regime. But it's really, in one way, it's misleading. Israel is much worse than South Africa was. The black working class in South Africa was super exploited, but because of that, they were part of the society. In Israel, the Palestinians were expelled. We saw, and you've written about this, and you write about this in the book, the beginnings of a movement throughout the Arab world, which in 2011 led to the overthrow of Egyptian dictator Mubarak. We had high hopes at that point. That movement was defeated. Do you think that today Palestinian liberation depends, as it did then, on liberation of the entire working class throughout the Middle East, throughout the Arab world? Or is there another way that Palestine can be liberated? We demonstrate here week in, week out for Palestine, which is of course very important, but we on our own, we can't achieve Palestinian liberation, much as important though our solidarity is to the Palestinians. How important, though, this is my final question before opening it up, how important do you think is the movement of the Arab working class previously and potentially to the liberation of Palestine?
Thanks, Sabby. I mean, we talked a few moments ago about class and about the problem of the contradiction within the Palestinian national movement of what I called a type of embryonic Palestinian bourgeoisie and its interests differing from those of the mass of Palestinians. But there's another aspect of social class which is very, very important in the region. And again, the book goes into this in some detail. One feature of Palestinian struggles over the years, right back to the 1930s, have been movements of what I would call solidarity and emulation in the states of the Arab region. In particular, since the 1980s, in states like Jordan, Algeria, and most importantly in Egypt. So I mentioned the 1930s Intifada, but of course there have been two other great intifadas. The Intifada of 1987, the Intifada of 2000. All of these intifadas lasted years because it took first of all the British and then the Israelis enormous efforts to put down the resistance. And this is a feature of Palestinian resistance, is what I would call direct democracy. So in the great intifadas, people organised themselves by and large from below. One very significant feature of this is the role of women, by the by, which the book looks at. The role of women, particularly of Palestinian peasant women, in taking the lead in resistance struggles, something the British and then the Israelis have found very, very difficult to deal with, particularly young women leading school strikes. And there's a whole fabulous history of Palestinian school strikes. But the key issue here is that struggling against overwhelming odds, particularly in the Intifada of the 80s and Intifada of 2000, people will recall the media images of the Palestinian kids with catapults confronting the Israeli tanks and showing just extraordinary bravery. Not because I think Palestinians are different from other people worldwide, but people who were involved in mass resistance, particularly against occupying powers, have for generations organised in this way. I mean, think of the struggles in Vietnam, for example, first against French and then against the American presence. Think about, closer to home, think about the resistance in Ireland. It took 300 years for Ireland to achieve its independence, and the movement came from below. In the case of the Arab region, people time and again have been energized by what they see in Palestine, people fighting against overwhelming odds, and drawing the conclusion that if people can struggle in this way against Israel and its powerful allies, then what about us? I mean, the most important example is the case of Egypt, especially after the Intifada, which began in the year 2000. For the next decade, up to the Egyptian revolution of 2011, key feature of Egyptian politics was Egyptian activists expanding the space. This is under the Mubarak dictatorship, expanding the space in which they were able to move politically, inspired by the Palestinian movement. In 2011, that rising movement, which had produced, for example, an independent trade union movement, mass strikes, a student movement, a revived women's movement, erupted into the Tahrir revolution, the revolution which very, very quickly got rid of Mubarak, not only because there were millions of people in the streets, but because there were mass strikes going on. If you were able, as I was, to participate in some of the great marches to Tahrir Square, involving maybe 2 million people, you'd have heard the slogan, Thawra, Thawra, Hatar al-Nasr, and the Arabic speakers in the room will know that that's revolution, revolution until victory. That was a Palestinian slogan, which had been learned and absorbed from the Palestinian movement, and there was an attempt to emulate the Palestinians. One of the difficulties which Sabby's referred to, and I'll conclude, Sabby, if I may, you've referred to South Africa and the way in which the struggle for liberation there was ultimately brought to a successful conclusion by the African workers' movement. The tragedy of the Palestinian national movement is that the nature of the Nakba, the dispersion and atomization of Palestinian society, meant that the Palestinian working class in 1948 disintegrated. Organised working class resistance plays a key role in many mass movements, including mass movements of national liberation like South Africa. Palestinians don't have those muscles to flex. He's been dominated by Islamists, most importantly by Hamas, to a lesser extent by an organisation called Islamic Jihad. And these organisations are excoriated pretty much globally. They're regarded as terrorist organisations in North America and Europe, although I should say that there's a long history of people who fight in various ways against colonial and imperial forces being called terrorists. That's been, you know, as we know from the whole history of Ireland, for example. But Hamas is a very, very interesting organisation. It originates in Egypt in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood in the late 1920s. Al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood came to prominence in Egypt in the struggle against the British. The British ran a colonial state. And it achieved much of its success because it was the most intransigent in opposing the British, and also because in the mid-1930s it took up solidarity with Palestine. Another example of Palestine-Egypt connections. What it didn't do in Palestine was to join the PLO's armed struggle. So you had Fatah, and you had the various organisations of the Palestinian left, which people would have heard of, the Popular Front for Liberation, Democratic Front, so on and so forth. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was present in Palestine, didn't join those initiatives until the start of the Intifada of 1987, when in effect its own members said, you can't stand aside from this any longer, the Israelis are all over us, the Israelis, you know, are using every method against. And the Brotherhood in December 1987 more or less converts itself into Hamas, which means zeal, or spirit in Arabic. And they increasingly become the most effective in resisting the Israeli presence in Gaza. The PLO starts to fall away, and especially as it's evident the PLO is in negotiations with the Americans and the Israelis, Oslo process, but things are no better in Gaza. More and more Gazans rally behind Hamas. Hamas's aim is not very different from that of the PLO. They want the liberation of Palestine, but they come from an Islamist tradition. So what does this mean? They see political struggles as being infused with various sorts of religious belief. And that's not very unusual. I mean, historically, these sorts of developments happen all over the world. When the mini-state is established, the majority of Palestinians find out very, very quickly, or most majority of Gazans in particular, find out very, very quickly that this is a lousy deal. Their lives haven't changed, the Israelis are all over them, and really the only people who are putting up very much of an effective mass resistance are people under the leadership of Hamas. And I've just got to bring something else into this. Because Hamas had not been involved in an armed struggle against Israel in the 60s and 1970s, the Israelis had, because the Brotherhood had not been involved, the Israelis attempted to co-opt the Brotherhood. And they did this in a very, very, very interesting way. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and elsewhere had always prospered around the mosque. So not just for reasons of, you know, religious significance, but because mosques were used for schools, clinics, kindergartens, women's centres. This is how the Ikhwan organised in Egypt, for example, began to organise in Palestine. So what the Israelis did, they licensed the construction of mosques across the West Bank and Gaza. There was an enormous increase in the number of mosques. And this created a type of space within which the Brotherhood could organise. And the Israeli strategists were absolutely clear, and I've documented it in the book from Israeli sources. They were absolutely clear that they wanted to do this in order to provide a counterweight to the PLO. The final outcome was what American media people call blowback, sensational blowback, because Palestinian struggle hadn't gone away. You know, by in effect, you know, endorsing the activity of the Islamists, it didn't render the struggle of ordinary Palestinians over. And so Hamas in recent years has come to dominate the politics of Palestine. I come from the left. The left of the Palestinian movement has gone into very rapid decline for all sorts of reasons we don't have time to discuss here. And Hamas has come to prominence. I just want to say this, because I do come from the left. The overall agenda of Hamas, it's true of many Islamist organisations, tends to be very elitist and authoritarian. Palestinian struggles over the years have been grassroots struggles. Intifada is about grassroots. It's about struggle from below. Hamas doesn't really stand in that tradition. It's much more elitist and authoritarian, and I don't find it, it's inadequate to say it doesn't seem to be very attractive. It's what Palestinians have come up with at this point as a means of struggle, which is not different, in my view, from the means of struggle employed by people involved in anti-colonial movements all over the world. It's not different from the NLF in Vietnam. It's not different from the Algerian liberation struggle. You know, one could go on. It's not different from the early years of the ANC when guerrilla activities were part of the, part of the process.
Ireland.
Or indeed Ireland in our own recent history. That's where Hamas sits. And it's the Palestinian, in effect, collective decision to go down that track, which is, for me, the most important factor.
Right, thank you.
Ilan Pappé is very, very clear about this in his histories, the 20s and 30s. Anyone who resisted the Zionist movement, in the view of the leaders of the Zionist movement in the 20s and 30s, was a terrorist. Probably anti-Semitic, but certainly a terrorist. And the British talked about the people who were fighting back in the 20s and 30s. They were usually called bandits. I mean, the British have called, people around the world who resist their agendas bandits for generations. And there were all sorts of other very, unpleasant things which are said about them. But there's also been a long practice whereby people who resist dominant Western powers and who become quite tricky for Britain or France or the United States, they're not just done down, but there's a record since roughly the 1950s as identifying them as something called fascists. Once we'd had fascism in Europe, with all its bitter and horrible lessons, especially, of course, the Holocaust, then this new category, this new label fascist, could be applied to all sorts of people. So I don't know if anyone goes back this far. I don't quite remember this, but I've seen it in the literature. In 1956, Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt, who had nationalised the Suez Canal, according to Anthony Eden, British Prime Minister, is suddenly a fascist.
Yeah, I remember that.
A few years earlier, Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran, who had nationalised the Iranian oil industry, in which the British and the Americans had a very big stake, he's a fascist. In 2003, during the time of the Iraq War, George Bush came, he didn't coin this phrase, but he sort of, in quotes, popularised it. He began to talk about something called Islamofascism, drawing upon, rich scenes of Islamophobia which had developed over the years. And of course, into the box labelled Islamofascists, you put Hamas. Now, there's nothing fascist about Hamas, despite what various, particularly American and Israeli academics, want to tell you. But they're people who have fallen foul of the dominant ideology which says that people who resist relentlessly in various ways have got to be denigrated and done down. I mean, it's very important, I'd say us, I'm talking about the movement of solidarity with Palestine, to stand up to this sort of nonsense. And as time passes, the arguments start to fall away, they start to collapse. It's very, very important for us to stand up for them. The future, in a couple of sentences. Like Sabby, I see a future which is of a democratic unitary state in Palestine. And lots of people who are not hostile to the Palestinians would shake their heads. It's very important for us to say that this isn't a type of utopia. It's something which people have struggled for and are continuing to struggle for, just as they struggled for the generations in South Africa. And I'm sure we've often, amongst us, we've mobilised that argument. If you'd said in the 1970s that by the late 1980s, the apartheid regime, at least in its formal white racist structure, would be over, and that within a couple of years Nelson Mandela would be president, people would have wanted to take you away to somewhere secure. Ilan Pappé has produced a book which is on the shelves here, I noticed earlier. It's called Israel at the Brink. And Ilan argues that the internal contradictions in Israel are such that the Israeli project is already in crisis, and that Israelis are going to have to take very, very big decisions about their lives. They cannot go on in the same way. One of the factors, I don't have time to go, he gives 7 reasons or something. I don't have time to go into one of the factors he identifies is the impact upon Israel of the international movement. And our movement, in this country in particular, as it should be, given Britain's role in Palestine, is of profound importance. And you only have to look at the Israeli press, even the English language Israeli press, to see the impact of what goes on here upon Israelis. My last comment, though, is as follows. I live down in Dorset. I live down in the wild west. And my son, until recently, went to the local secondary school. When the invasion of Gaza started in 2003, he and his friends organised a series of school strikes. And they got several hundred students, 6th formers, to march from the school into town. I have to say the little town, Dorchester, I'd never seen anything quite like it, with Palestinian slogans and flags and so on. And I took that as a marker of the way in which the movement of solidarity has reached right deep into the society here, into, you know, big cities, of course, like this one, but even into little villages. Brackets. One of the reasons that Starmer's in such trouble at the moment is because people's disbelief and anger about the position the British government has taken, still supplying arms and so on. But my son's school did something more important. They organised a twinning relationship with the school in Ramallah on the West Bank. And we held students and some parents, we held a series of Zoom meetings with the young women in Ramallah. And they talked to us about their lives under occupation, the impact on their education, their hopes for Palestine. And I can remember in the last of these sessions, a young woman, 16 years old, said to us, look, she said, you may think that we don't see you, but that's not right. She said, we don't watch the BBC, that's useless to us. But we watch Al Jazeera every day. And as the months pass, we see these enormous demonstrations might be in Paris or Berlin, but most importantly in London, Edinburgh, Glasgow. We see vast numbers of people with Palestinian flags and placards and kufiyat, the Palestinian scarf. And she says, we know we are not alone. And despite everything, this is so important to us. She said, please continue to stand with us.
Thank you very much. Phil, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much.